who are we trying to protect, or what are we trying to protect and save? And what's the purpose? Like, what's the purpose of the public education system? Is it for the adults or is it for the kids? Is it for those jobs, all those people employed by West Ada? No, ultimately it's about the kids.
Senator Den Hartog, how are you?
I'm great. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for coming today. I know we had to get in and around a bunch of meetings you're having about apparently waste management, all kinds of other very exciting, glamorous political things.
Yeah, the life of a local legislator. The topics are endless.
Yeah. Margaret Carmel from Boise Dev, in one of our several interviews, she was mentioning that there was a big push. There's a big push last year, at least locally, to eliminate there's a policy, at least locally, that says, hey, look, when you're running for like city council or mayor or something like that, you don't do the R versus the D, because the bottom line is everybody's concerned with like functional things like potholes, right? And obviously we have people that run as Democrats or Republicans or independents at your level, but you're still dealing with like real functional stuff. It's like, listen, if we're not addressing the waste management, we're like missing the mark. Or if like we're not, for instance, education, if we're not addressing education, we're missing the mark. And it's like, does geometry really care about the R versus the D? Geometry does not care. Like geometry still circles.
No, it absolutely doesn't care. But it depends on your frame of reference when you're coming in to solve a problem. So what's your frame of reference as an R or a D coming in to solve that problem? And that makes a real big difference.
A huge difference. Mm-hmm. A huge difference. So in that vein, right, talking about education, because there are so many educational opportunities and nuances in this state, right? I actually have a neighbor who has a hybrid homeschool, private school program that's like very self-directed, but they like have guides that help you through it. I have a friend who's a staunch, massively independent homeschool mom, and she does not want a single penny or any regulation that comes with that penny from the state. My kids go to public school. I love the public school. I think it's great. That's not to say I love all public school systems. I just happen to think West Ada is a pretty dang good public school. We have all kinds of issues, right? And we have charter schools, we have private schools, we have, magnet schools, we have school choice. West Ada has several different schools of fine arts and medical sciences, things like this. So look, we got to unpack this. One of the biggest problems that people talk about in education is why, if I'm paying taxes and my kid goes to a private school, why don't I get that money that I paid in for taxes? You know a lot about this, way more than me. I would love if you just treated me like a 5-year-old, help me understand, like, what's the nature of funding for public schools? Is it good or bad for that money to follow somebody, in your opinion? Help me understand this.
Well, I think let's talk a little bit about that ecosystem that you mentioned first. And I think that's so important because in my opinion, there's no one solution that fits for every single family, every single child. So if you have more than one kid, you know this intuitively, right? Like your kids are different. Right. We were talking before we started recording, right? Like I have 3 kids. They're all very, very different. I have to treat them differently. I have to discipline them differently. And it's the same thing. It's the same thing in schooling. So maybe you're fortunate as a family, you find a school and it works for all your kids, or you find a school system and it works for all your kids. Fantastic. But that's not always the story. That's not always the case. So what we have in Idaho is we have a pretty healthy ecosystem of school choice, as I like to think about it. So, it's been well over, I think we're almost at 25 years now that we've had public charter schools in the state of Idaho. And sometimes people forget that charter schools are public schools, but they are a creation of the state. And charter schools have done a lot for education in the state of Idaho. They haven't achieved everything that we thought that they were going to when we first instituted public charter schools in the state of Idaho. But you've seen traditional public school districts respond because parents are like, oh, I'm interested in this offering at this other charter school, right, or at this. So you see things like in West Ada, you see these magnet schools developed within a district. They're like, oh, there's a demand, there's a need, there's a desire. We can serve kids by doing this. So that's one component of the ecosystem. Homeschooling is a really important component of the ecosystem in education in Idaho. Idaho has a long and rich history in the homeschooling community. We also have some ugly things in our past on homeschooling. Back in the 80s, we had families who were put in jail because they were homeschooling homeschooling their families because the state said you aren't following the law and putting your kids in school, and we're going to put you in jail. So those families fought for their constitutional right, which we know as parents is our responsibility to make sure our kids receive an education. So those parents fought for that, and we've defended that ever since then. So, Idaho, you don't have to register with your local district. You don't have to register or report to the state when you choose to homeschool your child. And I happen to think like that's fantastic. And I have the same thing. My kids attend a Christian school. I never had to tell the state that was the choice my family and I made, when we first put our son in pre-kindergarten. So all of these things are part of it. But coming back to the tax dollars, this is
right.
always where it gets dicey.
Right. And MTU Studios is the proud producer for the Ada County Sheriff Podcast, the Idaho Wildlife Federation Podcast, the State Representative Ted Hill Podcast, the Idaho State PTA Podcast, and many more. If you or your organization is thinking about starting a podcast, MTU Studios would love to help. Just check out mtustudios.com. And to be clear, I have heard people say, hey, Idaho is jailing parents for homeschooling. And then again, on like just a very basic cursory inspection, like, oh, like 4 decades ago. Yeah, that was bad. Right.
Yes,
like,
in the 80s.
Right. But that's not something that has happened.
Nope.
And that system change, and it has been defended very passionately and effectively. And that's not something that's happening in a contemporary manner, even in the least.
Correct.
Great.
Correct.
Great.
Absolutely
Okay.
correct. Yes.
I just want to make that point because people get dicey on it.
And I think it's important, though, to recognize that that's part of our history. And we have families who are connected to that, who are still part of Idaho, still part of our homeschooling community, that's a reality for. And depending on how old you are, maybe the 80s doesn't seem that long ago. It was decades ago. But it's important, I think, just to recognize that that's a real thing. But there's a reason we have fought and defended our parental rights in education so passionately, is because that was a real experience. It's not,
right.
Contemporary right now for our moment.
But it's important to remember, hey, look, this is what happens, or this is what can happen if we don't have these checks and balances, if we don't have these protections. And it is something, in fact, that we collectively, the state of Idaho, did do at one point, and that's bad. And we don't want that to come back.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. And I think that's really important. And you see with we've seen so much post-COVID, right, where parents are aware of what's happening, and more parents are, I don't know if experimenting is the right word, but they're trying new things. They're trying, hybrid solutions for their kids, where maybe their kids are in a classroom a few days a week and, being schooled at home the rest of the week, or they're doing some kind of homeschool co-op, or they're figuring out, how to band together and hire a teacher and start a micro school. Like, there's just so many creative things happening. And I think it's fabulous that our system allows for it. Right. We also have in Idaho, because this is also an important part of our ecosystem that doesn't happen in all states, we've always had pretty robust open enrollment, as we refer to it, which means, if you live in the West Ada School District and you wanted your kids to attend a Boise school, you could. We've always had that policy in the state of Idaho. We beefed it up several years ago with a new open enrollment law, saying every school district had to have an open enrollment policy that said, hey, if you've got room and families are interested in sending their kids to different schools, again, for whatever variety of reasons. We know the West Ada, the largest school district in the state, has a wide variety of offerings, all across their high schools, their middle schools, their elementary, right? They have different focuses, different interests. Kids are like, oh, I want that music program.
Right. I was going to say, they have the fine arts school. It's fantastic. They have a hardcore academic school. They have international baccalaureate offerings. They have all kinds of stuff.
Which is so great, right? Because again, these kids we are so far past the industrial age. We've kind of forgotten that sometimes in education. Like, the public education system was structured around, producing widgets so that our kids could go work in factories. And the districts that, in my opinion, are the most successful are the ones that have really gone so far beyond that and recognized, hey, we can do all these things. We can offer these different things, and, partner with families to have these great experiences, educational experiences for kids. And I think that's so exciting.
Yeah. Partnering with the family. Yeah. That's one thing. One major criticism, two major criticisms of my former school district and school system is, one, They're over COVID. You mentioned like, hey, parents are paying more attention. Oh yeah. Like nobody knew who their board members were pre-COVID. Nobody cared who the board member, like I didn't even know there was a board member or you know, whatever.
You are not alone.
You're right. And then all of a sudden in 2020, people were like, wait a minute. Wait, that guy's been running unopposed for 20 years. Like what? Yeah. And, you know, people obviously got involved. They're like, I don't agree with what's going on. And this is, so yeah, people were not paying attention. And the area I came from was not in favor of people going out and essentially engaging in exploring different educational options. They had a captive audience. They had a captive customer base. They did not want to lose it. And there's not, I'm not trying to be like conspiratorial, but it was like, they very much understood. They're like, if we lose these people, we're losing millions of dollars from the state. We need to make sure that like we shame these people. We take, you know, legal action against them. There was a group that was trying to put together like kind of a self-guided homeschool co-op. And it was like, that's totally reasonable. And man, I was trying to talk to this gal. I had a, you know, crappy old podcast then. It was not great, but I was trying to get this gal and can you just come and explain what you're doing? And she was so worried about the county and the state coming down on her. She's like, I would love to. There's no way I will ever talk about this, because they had to keep it quiet because they didn't want to get, and again, that's a different state, different time. So people's anxiety around state, it's like, I think a lot of that bleeds into this area, but it's like, that's not happening in this area, right? Like you don't have.
Unfortunate.
Yeah. Oh, it was terrible.
Yeah.
It was the absolute worst thing ever.
Well, and you think back to, I think it's challenging for us to wrap our minds around when we have, you know, large cities, large communities, large school districts. But if you take it back to, and this is why like elected school board members, like it is one of the hardest and most thankless elected positions that exists. Like bless those people who run for local school board. And no one realized, well, some people realized, but not everyone realized how important those people were until, you know, 2020 and 21, when all these, you know, decisions and things are coming to light. But if you take it back to, if you picture, you know, particularly here in the West, when you picture a small town and a community coming together and they're like, we're gonna start a school, we're gonna make sure our kids are educated. We're all working on the farm, but we're gonna gather our kids together and we're gonna hire a teacher, and she's gonna be the quote unquote public teacher because we're all pitching in and paying her salary. Like that's who we're gonna choose, you know, to provide this education for our kid. That really is the model. And obviously public education has exploded from that, but that's the idea. It's like that idea of partnering. And when you lose that idea of the teachers and schools and districts and, you know, everybody involved in a school organization partnering with the family, you miss out on a lot.
You miss out on so much. And it is a partnership. Yeah. Like that's the thing. My wife and I were both educators professionally, and going into the public school that we originally did when our kids were very young. And the first one went in, it's like, oh, you guys aren't like you have this job. That's fine. Like you went through some hiring process, you know, like 20 years ago. Yeah. You don't care at all about who you're dealing with, like nothing. And it's again, like we're happy to volunteer. It's not like either of us were trying to do anything outside the absolute normal participation and like showing up for our kids. But that system was not interested in partnering, nor was it interested in partnering with the different. Okay. One thing I think is beautiful about at least the West Ada School District is, when I was getting ready to move here, a friend of mine was saying, the school district here is different. Like, this is different. It's not what you think. Because I was looking immediately, a mistake on my part, I was wrong. I was immediately looking for private schools. Yeah. The mass distrust I had in the public education system, justifiably from there, right? And I was accusing the public education system here of doing the same things. Just look, I'm not going to public school. And she was like, no, you don't understand. It's first off, it's not like that. And they were from my area, dear friends of mine. They said also there are these other options that schools that kids can engage in. And her son was taking, I think, like a welding class, and then he wanted to go into like become a fireman. So he was taking, you know, prerequisites, interesting things like that. One of the criticisms I've had about the other school districts in other areas that don't partner with a wide variety of students and help them find valuable contributions that they can engage in instantaneously upon graduation is that that's not a partnership. Like if my kid's really into cars, or my kid's really into trades, or my kid's really into something like this, if I have a public school system that's only interested in producing like a 99% college matriculation rate, they are not partnering with me as a parent or with my students saying like, okay, let's find the thing that will help you contribute the best and most to the community that you want to engage in. That's the real partnership, which is like, look at my kid, look at what he's doing. Stop telling me college is the only option, because that's just overwhelmingly not true.
And that's why having every part of that education ecosystem be vibrant and healthy is important. So we'll come back to your funding and money question. I promise I won't. I don't think you dodged me.
There's a lot that has to do with education.
But when that whole ecosystem is healthy, because those of us in school choice now is this kind of catch-all term that means a lot of things, or it can mean something very, very narrow when people are trying to use it in a negative connotation. And so when that whole ecosystem is working, that means the public schools are healthy. That means our public charter schools are healthy. That means our homeschooling community is healthy. That means our private schools are healthy. So that we're a hybrid of any of those, so that families can figure out what works for them, what works for their kids. And, you know, we get accused, as those of us who advocate for school choice, and I've been accused of this for years, of wanting to, you know, tear down the public education system. I'm like, that's literally the last thing I want. The majority of kids are being educated in our public education system. I want it to be great. I want it to work for families that choose that. I want the other options to be great. I'm like, I think we can hold all of those things as truth together.
Well, this is at the heart of the school choice criticism and difficulty, right? The funding. It's not should private schools exist, right? It's not should public schools exist. It's somebody pays some money into a bucket, and then how that bucket gets distributed. And the people paying the money in, the taxpayers, are saying, hey, you have an obligation to explain to me where this money's going and why it's going there. And you shouldn't be allowed to spend it in certain areas, right? This is at the heart of it, right? So let's get into it. We pay money in taxes. That goes to public schools. The idea of tax credits or voucher systems or school choice, bottom line is there's some manner of state funding that gets pumped into a private school and not a public school. Am I accurate in saying this?
Well, there's no manner of money that goes to a private school. All the money goes to public.
No, not now.
Yes, correct. Yes.
Right now, all of the money goes to public school. So if I want to go to private school, I'm self-funded. Yep. But the idea, like the tax credits, essentially just saying, okay, you would have owed us this money, but now we're going to like effectively give you that money back.
A little bit back.
The voucher program is, hey, we're going to give you this voucher. You can take this, and it has a certain monetary value for the public school versus the private school, like the whole thing. There are all manners of ways of doing this. But the bottom line is, trying to get money that people pay into this bucket to follow their kids around to wherever the institution is providing theoretically the best education to that kid. Yep. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's absolutely accurate. And this goes back to, you know, how you approach a problem. So what you said at the very beginning is really, really foundationally important to this discussion, is that the money at the state level that we are allocating towards education is taxpayer money. That is your money. That is my money. That is our neighbor's money. That is like, we are the ones paying into that system. We are the ones paying its sales and income tax that go to the state. That's what the state gets to distribute. Local property tax is, you know, a totally different thing, but none of that comes to the state. So all that money, and this is why I tell people too, you have to understand, you know, any level of government, we love to like dice things up. We're like, well, that's sales and income tax. This is property tax. And people are like, I'm just paying all these taxes. I don't care which part of the government you're from. Like, you are taking all my money. So
my dollar doesn't look different going to you than it does to someone else.
Maybe it came out of my left pocket. Maybe it came out of my right pocket, but it came out of my pocket. You
still took my money.
You still took my money. And that's where I think that's so fundamentally important, is that when we start talking about sending that out differently, people have become possessive of that funding. So at the state level, when we send funding to our local public schools, and local public schools have some funding through local property taxes, and then the majority of it is happening at the state level, right? So, and that's the structure. That's the way of it. So now we're in this new century. We're in this new era. Now we're over 2 decades into this 21st century, and we still want to do things the way that we did them, as my kids like to say, in the 1900s. And I'm like, yeah, we need to look at doing it differently. And that means, again, it doesn't mean dismantling that system. It means keeping it healthy and alive and vibrant. But let's say families of means, and this is where it's really important. Families of means already have choice. They look at a house that they might want to purchase. They look at a school district. They say, that's a good school. I want my kids to go there. I'm going to buy that house in that neighborhood and send my kids to that school. They're already exercising choice that maybe a family with lesser means can't exercise. Now, we talked a little bit about open enrollment, and that factors in too. So maybe a family with, fewer means says, well, I want that really good school in that really great neighborhood, but now I got to figure out how to transport my kid there, because the bus isn't going to come pick them up in my neighborhood. So these are all the things wrapped up in choice that are so important. So what we talk about, and I've been an advocate for, we've looked at things like education savings accounts over the years. This last year, we worked on a refundable tax credit program, and we've looked at all kinds of different options to give families a little bit of money back to say, exercise that choice. Do what you think is best for your kid. In Idaho, we haven't ever been successful at doing anything that would be considered like a full-fledged voucher to say, whatever we spend, as a student in, the public school system, we're going to give you that same amount dollar per dollar that you can go spend, at a wherever. So we've never done that. But the idea of the refundable tax credit, it either offsets the taxes that you owe to the state, or it gives you, a little bit of cash back to say like, okay, maybe that will help cover some tuition at a private school if that's what I want, or maybe it will help cover some of my costs as a homeschooling family if that's the option that I'm choosing. And to me, that's so important because it's their money. It's the taxpayers' money. And I think sometimes at the state level and in government, we forget whose money it is, and we become possessive. And we do this all the time, right? Because when we're setting all the budgets at the state level, we're like, oh, this money is for transportation. This money is for health and welfare. This money is for prisons. And it's like mine, each different slice of the pie. And it's like, at the end of the day, it's not ours. Like we're stewards of it, and we have to think about it that way.
Okay. Got it. Here's a question. The underlying assumption is, hey, the school district that's public or the school that you're going into is not the best option for you. Okay? Totally fine. And you're saying, hey, we should go to this other school and we're going to fund it by the state. So we're taking the taxpayer dollars of retired people, of people with no kids, of people with kids. We're taking all this money and putting it into this private school, whatever the money is, right? Irrelevant to me. Let's make the gross assumption that private schools are distributed across the best to the worst evenly, like everything else. You're going to have the best producing, you're going to have the worst producing. So let's look at like the bottom 10%. And let's say in the bottom 10% of private schools, they're not delivering a very good education. Let's even make the horrible assumption that the bottom 10%, like the last private school, is actually worse than some of the public schools. Let's just throw that out there. How do we worry as a state about saying, okay, we're taking taxpayer dollars and giving it to the bottom 10% of private schools, which may not even be better than our public schools? Is that something we should consider? And if it is, how do we identify that?
I would argue that if they're in the bottom 10%, parents are unhappy and they're walking out and their doors are closed. And that's the difference. That's the difference between a public institution that we are going to hold up at all costs versus a private institution that really has to come to the self-realization of, oh, we're not serving the families like we thought we were, and they've left. So we don't have enough to sustain us, and we're going to close our doors.
Right. They have the burden of actually producing that like, you know, but do public schools have a burden of producing test scores?
Absolutely.
Right. So we're not going to uphold them up under, you know, no matter what. Right. They still have to produce, like, we will still have a public education system, but they have to produce certain results, or else there are repercussions.
Minor repercussions.
Okay.
So, you know, when that happens, again, because we want them to be healthy and thriving. You know, if you're in the state of Idaho, if your public school's in the bottom 5%, you get identified. The state has a program. You know, the state doesn't come in and take over your school district, but you have to have a willing school district that really looks back and does some self-reflection and says, we need to change things around. Like, we don't want to be in the bottom 5%. And this has been one of the things I've struggled with in the education system is it's really difficult. It seems like we have a collective difficult time with doing the hard work of saying, we're not living up to expectations. We're not helping the kids. We're not doing what we should be doing for them. And people get defensive. And to me, that posture of defensiveness doesn't solve anything. So you have to be honest. You have to be honest about what you're doing, what services you're providing, how you're addressing the kids that are walking through your door. Right. And that's what matters. Like, if you aren't being responsive, but we don't shut them down. Now, the only exception to that, and we have seen this over the years, is our public charter schools they have a performance certificate.
Sure.
And so they have to go through a pretty rigorous process when they go through, you know, essentially a recertification of their existence. And we have had some public charter schools that have closed down for various reasons. Some have been closed down by our charter commission to say, you didn't meet your performance standards. We gave you these options and opportunities to improve, and you didn't. And then on the reverse, you've had some that didn't have enough student body. They thought they were going to be a great charter school. They didn't attract. And they're like, you know what? Or they didn't attract, or they didn't perform. And they're like, we don't have enough student bodies to sustain our existence. So we're going to close our doors. And to me, that's like the ultimate parent accountability, because, you know, a school could have great test scores and not be working for your kid. Like, your kid could be in a school that has, you know, maybe they're knocking it out of the park on every single thing, and your kid is not working. Maybe he's being bullied, you know, whatever the circumstances are. And so at the end of the day, when you're the parent of that kid that is not working for it, you're like, I don't care about those test scores. I don't care about all of that. Like, I need to try something else because it's not working for my kid.
Right. That process you just described, which is like, hey, you have to meet this metric, charter school, you have to meet this performance. Is there any discussion of having any of that style of protocol for private schools?
There is a little bit. We've had that idea came about later in the charter school movement in Idaho. Mm-hmm. So when charter schools were first instituted in the state of Idaho, I think the law passed in 98. First charter schools opened in 99. The idea of performance certificates didn't exist. So that's only been around, I think, in the last 10-ish years, maybe a little bit longer. But the idea was parents, you know, accountability is parents walking with their feet and taking essentially their public dollars somewhere else to say that charter school, I thought that was going to work. It didn't. So it's a newer or newish idea in the charter school community, but enough that we've lived through some cycles of schools, you know, having to close, that kind of thing. So the idea, and this is where it depends what type of school choice policy you're talking about and what type of accountability metric you should consider. So something like an education savings account where parents have funds that they could spend on all kinds of things. And, you know, obviously we've heard, you know, these stories coming out of Arizona, and people are like, they're all upset. They're like, well, parents have spent money on, you know, swimming lessons and horseback riding lessons, or, you know, whatever. I'm like, well, we do some of these things in the public school too, right? Like we offer a wide variety of things to meet the needs. This is just a family doing it on the individual basis. So you have to decide and pick your metric. And I think those conversations are ongoing. Now, when you're talking about something like a refundable tax credit, a good example and one that I've used is we have the grocery tax credit in Idaho. I think now it's $200 per person in your household. Well, the state doesn't come back to you when you file your income taxes, you know, in April. The state doesn't come back to you and say, hey, show me exactly how much you spent on groceries and where. Tell me what kind of food you bought for your kids. Tell me what kind of food you're eating in your house. Like, we don't do that. We make certain assumptions under the grocery tax credit and say, We're just giving you some of your own money back, right? And to me, that's why I like the refundable tax credit idea, because it really is taking it back to the family unit at the beginning of the day where the responsibility lies, and says, ultimately, who's responsible for making sure your child is educated? It's us as the parents.
So it sounds like, and again, I really want to be clear on this, so tell me if you're like, Matt, you missed the mark completely. It sounds like, one, you feel that market forces are going to be a great determining factor in whether or not a private school will stay in existence or not. So to some degree, there's already a quality metric and protocol in existence, just because if a school's doing a really bad job, people will not spend their money there. They have freedom. They're like, no, I'm going somewhere else. So that's already in existence. And that essentially makes, and on top of that, because that already exists and we give freedom with, for instance, what food you might want to buy from the store, we already give freedom with refunding some things that we feel the state should not be taxing people on, or things like that. And because we have market forces, and because we already have this, we've set a precedent. We've set a precedent with, hey, look, the state's going to get out of this or give you more of your money back. We then go ahead and we should have something analogous like that in education. Is that?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's how I look at it. I think those market forces are powerful. And again, because when people take ownership of something, when they understand, what we've been talking about with the refundable tax credits, in some places might cover all tuition. In some places, it might only cover a portion of tuition or a portion of your costs. When people have that personal skin in the game, they think about it differently. I've long said, when you look at your property tax bill, once a year, whether you pay them, every 6 months or once a year, or whether people are looking at them at all because they're going to their escrow account under their,
Sure.
under their mortgage payment. If we made people pay those expenses once a month, like if you had to write your check to your local public school district, if you had to write your check to the city,
Right.
to the county, you're paying all these things. But if you now we don't physically write checks very much anymore, right? But if you physically had to sit down and pay each of those bills every single month, I think it would change the mindset. And this is one of the things I've shared publicly. My kids go to a Christian school, and we pay tuition monthly. Like we write that check. So it matters to us. It matters to us, the quality. It matters to us. Actually, more importantly for us, it matters the relationships that they have with their teachers. It matters what kind of friendships they're developing, what they're being taught, how they're being taught to think, the ways that they're being challenged. And so we have serious skin in the game, and we all do in public education. We just don't think about it that way always.
Yeah. Yeah. What about the difficulty with another difficulty that people have, aside from like, hey, you're taking public funds and giving it to a private entity. Another difficulty that I've heard people express is, all right, but who gets to go to these things? Because if there's money going in this that I paid, is it available for everyone just like the public school? And the answer is, as of now, it appears no. It's like, no. This school gets to continue functioning as a private entity. We do not have control over their enrollment. And that obviously creates a slew of problems, which is, okay, well, then they're going to cherry pick perhaps the best and brightest, which will make their school look better in the first place because they've selected now the best and brightest. Because look, I did SAT prep and ACT prep and college entrance for almost 20 years. I did not select my students, right? So if you looked at my, let's say, average SAT performance, let's say it was like a 25 or something, or excuse me, not 25, but like a 1200. I did ACT too, right? Let's say it was a 1200. I knew a couple guys who were like totally good guys and good at what they did. They said, look, we only take people 1400 and above because we're really looking at that last little niche to get from people from 1400 to 1600. Totally fine there too. And again, these were not bad guys, but they advertised and boasted our average SAT score is like a 1500. And in fact, they came to me like, hey, listen, if we had a student that was like at a 1300, could you do like the preliminary work to get them up to that 1400 bump? And then we take them. I'm like, yeah, sure. Doesn't matter to me, right? But again, because they were able to select from the top, they boasted far better results. But that betrayed the reality that they were selecting. And perhaps I was in, like, my average improvement was like roughly 200 points. Okay. Maybe they on a perfect Gale from 1,400 to 1,600, they would be going up 200 points. So I was improving people on average more, but they were dealing with a smaller, segment of the population and potential improvement. So like, how do we flush that out? Because as you're pointing out, when people, the other issue with allowing selection from private entities is that their results may appear to be superior to public school results, but that may not actually be true. It's like, okay, you may have better college matriculation, but you may have selected for that in your admissions process, or you have parents that are potentially more educated or more geared towards education. So you're going to have more participation and help from home, things of this nature, right? Like that whole selection process becomes really tricky.
It absolutely is, but I also think we can't think too narrowly about where the market is. So we've seen this in other states where their school choice programs have exploded, that the existing options on the market or the options that were there before their programs got initiated are now in competition with, double the number of options. So I think you have to consider that how it looks today may not be what it looks like in the future in terms of what's available in the marketplace when more people have access to funds for their children's education and they could take them to different places. My experience with our private Christian school is, they're not selecting students based on, their academic abilities, but they're looking at families. And to your point, being selective based on their religious affiliations, their involvement, all of those kinds of things, which could lead, in some instances to different types of academic outcomes. But I think you have to consider that we don't know what the market could do when you expand it. This is what I'm talking about. People with means already have choice. When you expand the people with means, the market has to respond. If that school says, I'm full, I can't take any, then, someone else maybe sees an opportunity. They're like, well, now there's all these families and they're clamoring for these options and they have some real money that could help them, and we could start something up and we could respond and meet that need. And the same way, I've seen it with schools, with private schools all over the place. Like they've expanded their offerings because families are asking for it. Just like they're responding the same way our public school system is responding. They're saying, we don't want everyone to go on to college, or we don't want just cookie cutter kids. Like we want to make sure they're prepared and ready for life. They want to be, engaged in civics, like, ready
Right.
to be, productive members of society. Like it's all of it. It's not just producing those kids with great test scores. Like to me as a mom, like that's one of the things I actually care about the least. I want my kids to do their best. I want them to give their best effort. But at the end of the day, like what their actual test scores are doesn't matter to me. I want them to be good human beings.
Right. Speaking of public schools then, as public schools are trying to respond to these market forces as well, let's look at West Ada. West Ada is the best large public school in the state of Idaho for math and ELA. They're doing a lot with very little. They actually get less funding than the state average per student. I think it's like just around $6,000, and Idaho average is like $9,000. Yep. So they're doing a lot with less funding and a huge district that they have to manage. How would they be affected by this? Let's say you snap your fingers and we have school choice. Let's say $5,000 goes to every student if they want to go outside of West Ada. How would West Ada be affected by this?
I don't think any district is instantaneously impacted. And part of that is those market forces that I was talking about. If, the private Christian schools and the private schools that exist in the Treasure Valley that I'm aware of, many have waiting lists. A lot of our public charter schools have waiting lists. So it would never be...
Well, it's not a light switch. Let's go 24 months out.
It's never a light switch.
Or 36 months out.
Yeah. Maybe they lose enrollment, which means maybe they don't have to go to the voters and say, because West Ada has had kind of a different problem than some of our districts across the state. They've been growing so much, right? So many people are moving here. It's a fabulous place to live. Demand is high, great school district. And so, they've been having to go to voters for some serious bond questions. Like, I mean, we're talking real money that they're going to their voters with. They're like, we need to build, 5 new elementary schools, 2 new high schools, 4 middle schools, all the things, right? So maybe that means the burden becomes a little bit less. Maybe they don't have to build as much because now there's kids who are getting their education in a different way. So I think we have to reframe our minds around who are we trying to protect, or what are we trying to protect and save, and what's the purpose? Like, what's the purpose of the public education system? Is it for the adults or is it for the kids? Is it for those jobs, all those people employed by West Ada? No, ultimately it's about the kids. And that's why I talked about that ecosystem at the beginning. Like we want all of it to be vibrant. And that doesn't mean there won't be, some things, but we've seen that even without school choice. We've seen a really big district, a neighboring district in Nampa. Their school board just voted to close 4 schools because of declining enrollment. And that's before we've even implemented anything. And yet a neighboring district, Valley View School District, they just passed a bond. They're breaking ground to build more schools. And some of that is a function of these crazy school district boundaries that we have in the state of Idaho. And so those decisions will have to be faced by each of those entities. But at the end of the day, it's about serving the kids in our communities and making sure that they can find what works best for them.
Gotcha. I have heard a lot of people say, hey, look, a program like we're talking about, taking the taxpayer dollars away from the public school, will hollow out the public school because it will most likely take out the higher performing students and put them elsewhere. So the metrics for the public school will go down, the quantifiable values of test scores and whatnot. It will also make it more difficult to address the fixed cost of public schools, right? Because we don't, like if you look at a whole building of a school and you say, okay, now we're going to occupy it only by 80%, you don't get an 80% reduction in maintenance cost. You don't get an 80% reduction in all the other expenses. If you have a classroom of say 30 and you take away 20% of those people, you're going down to 24 students. That doesn't mean you can consolidate that with another classroom because you can't just do like 48 students. And maybe if you have enough classes, you drop one, but you still have to pay that teacher, those pensions and things of that nature. Is that a concern of yours, or do you think that again, market forces would play in and correct that?
I have a recognition of our responsibility as a state. We have a constitutional obligation to provide a public education system that's available. And this is where people who support school choice are probably on some kind of spectrum, right? Like there's a wide variety of us and for different reasons. And so, there may be some, on a far end that are like, well, we want to see public education system dismantled. I'm like, well, then you got to talk about changing the Constitution. Right. So yeah, the state has an obligation to make sure that we can maintain those fixed costs. Like I think that's part of that. So that maybe it does cost more when we say now we're going to give. It's not a 1-to-1. It's not, to your point, where if it's let's say it's at $9,000 per student and we say okay, everyone's going to get $9,000 per student. Sure. We still have an obligation as a state to make sure that we are maintaining that system. So maybe that means if we open up this program, there are additional costs, not only because we're providing some funding to families that maybe haven't had access to funding before, but because now we have an obligation to help maintain some of those fixed costs.
Gotcha.
So I think we have a constitutional responsibility and an obligation to still fulfill that.
That's a really fair point, which is, hey, this may cost us more. Yep. It may in fact be, say we have $100 million, and I know it's more than that, but say we have $100 million allotted for education, pre-voucher or whatever program. If we add this option in, it may go up to $120 million. And again, making up the numbers. But the point is that I think that's one of the fairest things I've heard people talk about this, because most people are like, no, we'll save money or we'll do this. And they're like, no, it may cost us more. But what we get out of it is money following students and people that are paying into this bucket of taxes, feeling like they get more value for their taxes. And yeah, that may mean more dollars coming out collectively. The last piece, when you're talking about obligations of the state and the constitutional obligations, one of the last big pieces that I've heard that people criticize the idea of giving public dollars to private entities is the religious aspect of it, which is, hey, say I'm an atheist, and I am not saying that, but say I'm an atheist and I am paying into the state of Idaho. I'm like, hey, why are my tax dollars going to that Christian school over there? Right. And that's, again, my kids were going to private Catholic school before we moved here. Like I understand the value of different school systems and, not just from an academic, but a citizen, morality, the whole thing. But I also understand that criticism of, hey, why are my tax dollars going to a religious-based institution? How do we reconcile that? Or is it something we even need to worry about?
It's something we're already doing. We do it in higher ed all the time. And to some extent, we're doing it in not all of K-12, but for sure in high school.
Okay, so explain higher ed to me. So we have private religious universities, right?
Yeah.
How do our taxpayer dollars go to that?
So we have both state and federal programs, grant and student loan programs that students apply to, Pell Grants, the federal program. You can go to a private religious college or university and be eligible for a Pell Grant based on your income. You could be eligible for different student loans. It doesn't matter. Like the federal, particularly the federal programs, are agnostic as long as schools meet certain requirements that that those students can be eligible. And in the state of Idaho, some of our biggest examples is we have the Advanced Opportunities Program, it covers a wide variety of different costs for high school students and some middle school students. Most students are using those for dual credit classes they're taking in high school but getting college credits for. We have the College of Idaho, which is a private institution, Northwest Nazarene University, which is a private institution, BYU Idaho, which is a private religious institution, that are granting those credits and receiving some of those advanced opportunities dollars. Mm-hmm. And that's a mix of students that are in high school but getting college credit. So we're already doing this in the state of Idaho. And frankly, this is one of the things...
if I may, real fast. Okay. Wonderful examples. Does this bring us back to the idea that there's some kind of requirement for BYU or Nazarene or, University of Idaho? Like I can't just open up a university and say, I actually have, my company name was Matt Todd University. So like, okay, I'm Matt Todd University now. I can't just open my doors and get students applying and being accepted and then getting those funds, right? Like I have to meet a threshold.
Yeah, and the Advanced Opportunities is a unique set of circumstances, right? Because you have a high school student who's being taught in a high school building by a high school teacher, but getting college credit for that. So yeah, those institutions of higher education have gone through a process to be a higher education institution. They're accredited or something. Right. So those are things you can talk about, but this is where, and I would pick this bone with higher ed, but that would probably be a whole other podcast. But this is where in education, so often we're worried about the inputs and we're not worried about what's actually coming out the other end. Like where are kids at the end of the day? We're worried about like controlling all of these things at the beginning of the process. And did the student care that their teacher was, that their school is accredited, that they, we've proved that with homeschooling in Idaho. I've met, hundreds of homeschool families and their kids have been accepted and gone on to college, right? Like,
oh, sure.
They weren't being taught by, maybe their mom probably wasn't, a certified teacher in the state of Idaho, but they received
plenty successful.
So that's where, yes, there are those metrics now in place for those controls for things like the Advanced Opportunities Program and, the federal Pell Grants and those kinds of things. But I think we get so wrapped up in that in education that we lose sight of what's really important at the end of the day.
Sure. And again, you and I can agree that there are plenty of examples of religious-based educations that are successful and great, and maybe the teachers don't have the same accreditation requirements that, say, a public school teacher. Be that as it may, for my personal choice or your personal choice, I think the concern that the taxpayers have, right, which again, whoever the taxpayers are saying, hey, what about your obligation to not do this thing? And I get that you're saying, hey, look, we already do that to some degree, but then it comes back to, yeah, we do it to some degree, but these companies that we're doing that with, we're giving the religious-based companies that we're giving taxpayer dollars to, they had a requirement that they had to meet to get that money. So again, like bottom line is, it sounds like you're saying, hey, we're not focusing on the right thing. If we're worried about accreditation, or if you were sitting with a taxpayer who was like, I don't like this because these aren't accredited, it sounds like you're saying, yeah, but you may be thinking about the wrong things. What we need to think about is the result at the end of the educational experience, and not, what kind of accreditation this company went through.
Yeah. And that's one of the things, frankly, that in the years that I've served in the legislature, that I haven't been able to crack. And when I say I mean like we, a lot of us have been thinking about and talking about, when we talk about, people use the word reform or improve, or,
Sure.
pick your whatever. But if something's not working, you're like, oh, we got to figure this out. I think we've spent so many years and decades focusing on the wrong thing in public education, and it's been the inputs. And so I would like to do a lot of the same things we're talking about, when we talk about opening up and expanding school choice in the state of Idaho, do some of those same things for our traditional public schools. Say, stop reporting that. Stop worrying about that. Like, focus on your kids, focus on your community, be responsive to your parents and, the kids that are walking through your doors. And a lot more would be right with the world if we did that. And, we hear from teachers and administrators are like, oh, we have all this reporting and all this stuff. And, for years I've been like, okay, give me a list. Like, what do we need to cut out in state law to ease that reporting burden on you? Because the more that we require at the state level, the less time they have to focus on, the students and their student needs and what's going on in the classroom. Now, and again, that also would be another future podcast, but, what do we need to essentially not dismantle the system, but dismantle within that system to give them freedom as well, to be able to serve their students. It's a lot.
It's a lot. I was hoping that we would have solved the whole thing, but God, wouldn't it? I really appreciate you. I know you're in the middle of workday. Is there anything we've missed? We've talked about a lot of different aspects of this. Is there anything that you really want to hammer at the end here?
I think what is really important to remember is we don't just do things as elected officials because it's something we think we want to do.
Right.
We do things because it's percolating up, like it's coming up from the people who sent us into office. Right. It's not, certainly there are some things that and this is something for me that I've genuinely, passionately cared about for a long time. But we've seen changes and turnover in our legislature that have hinged on this issue. And I just saw and I haven't had a chance to see the whole quote, but I just saw, Condoleezza Rice and others across the country are saying school choice is a civil rights issue of our day. Like, it is that important. And it is that important to not only the people of Idaho, but it's important to people all across this country. And I think it can't be ignored. So we have to talk about it. We have to address it, and we have to answer the important questions. So I really appreciate the chance to be on and talk about it. So I could talk about this all day long.
I love it. I would love to have you back to talk more about it. Because again, not just school choice, but the education system in general has really become this battleground for people. And education is so important for everyone, but it's important because it's their children. Right. And then all these questions came from like, wait, who are we giving our children to? Yeah. Who are we offering them? Like, who are we entrusting? Yeah. And these are questions that really need to be forefront in parents' minds, in my opinion. Right. And I'm not trying to preach to anyone, but like, and what works for you may not work for me and vice versa, the whole thing. But education is not something that's going to be solved. And I don't think it ever should be, frankly. I think education is something that should always be a topic that's getting wrestled with because our populations change, our needs change, the realities of education change. I mean, just look at the tech we have. Right. The world keeps changing, and the realities of technology and what that has done to our education system changes. Like, we're never going to solve it, and we never should, because we're never going to stop changing. So thank you for doing what you're doing. Thank you for coming in and explaining this. It's been the best conversation about this I've ever been part of. So
well, thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. Coming again. MTU Studios is the proud producer for the Ada County Sheriff Podcast, the Idaho Wildlife Federation Podcast, the State Representative Ted Hill Podcast, the Idaho State PTA Podcast, and many more. If you or your organization is thinking about starting a podcast, MTU Studios would love to help. Just check out mtustudios.com.